Hello and welcome to Lyla's Lullabies, where we spend time exploring with Lyla, a traveler who wanders the world at her own pace, while sharing her most enriching and restorative moments with you. In tonight's story, we'll follow Lyla as she visits the great beauty, the eternal city of Rome, Italy. There's nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to remember. Just settle in, get comfortable, and let yourself go. We're so glad you're here. Whenever you're ready, let's begin. The train pulled into Roma Termini just as the morning light was beginning to soften from gold to white. Lyla gathered her day bag from the overhead rack and joined the steady stream of passengers moving toward the doors. She had taken an early train from Florence, wanting to give herself a full day in Rome, and now, as she stepped onto the platform, she felt that familiar flutter of anticipation that came with arriving somewhere both ancient and alive. The station was busy but not overwhelming, and she made her way through it with the flow of travelers, following signs toward the exit. Outside, the air was cool and crisp, distinctly autumnal, and she was glad she had brought a light jacket. The sky was a pale, clear blue, the kind of sky that promised a beautiful day. She had decided to walk to the Colosseum rather than take the metro, wanting to ease into the city at her own pace. According to the map on her phone, it was perhaps 30 minutes on foot, and the route would take her through streets she had never seen before. She set off, adjusting the strap of her bag on her shoulder. The streets near the station were wide and traffic-heavy, lined with hotels and cafes just beginning their morning routines. She passed a small bar, where a few men stood at the counter drinking espresso, their conversation animated and punctuated by gestures. The scent of coffee drifted out as she walked by, rich and inviting. As she moved away from the station, the streets became narrower and quieter. She found herself on Via Cavour, a long avenue that sloped gently downward, and she could see the city spreading out before her, all terracotta roofs and cream-colored buildings under the morning light. Occasionally she caught glimpses of domes and bell towers rising above the roofline, hints of the history layered beneath the modern surface. She passed shops that were still closed, their metal shutters painted with faded murals and graffiti tags. A man was sweeping the sidewalk in front of his gelateria, moving the broom in long, practiced strokes. He looked up as she passed and nodded, and she smiled back. The walk gave her time to let go of the train journey, to transition from traveler to explorer. She noticed the way the light hit the buildings at this hour, creating sharp shadows and highlighting architectural details she might have missed otherwise. Balconies overflowed with plants, some still flowering even this late in the year. Geraniums in pots, trailing ivy, the occasional burst of bougainvillea. As she drew closer to the Colosseum, the streets became more crowded with other tourists, all moving in the same direction. She heard snatches of different languages, Spanish, Japanese, German, and noticed tour groups beginning to form, guides holding up umbrellas or flags to keep their parties together. And then, quite suddenly, she turned a corner, and there it was. The Colosseum rose before her, massive and ancient and somehow improbable, as if something that old and that large shouldn't still be standing. Lyla stopped walking and simply looked at it for a long moment, taking it in. The morning light caught the arches and the weathered stone, and she could see where pieces were missing, where time and earthquakes and human intervention had left their marks. But it was beautiful in its incompleteness, dignified in its age. She approached slowly, wanting to absorb every detail. She had purchased a ticket online, which allowed her to skip the longest lines, and she was grateful for this bit of planning as she made her way to the entrance. The security check was quick and efficient, and soon she was inside, climbing the ancient stairs to the first level. The interior opened up before her, and she paused at the railing, looking down into the exposed underground chambers where gladiators and animals had once waited. The floor that would have covered these chambers was gone now, revealing the network of passages and rooms beneath. It was like looking at the skeleton of the building, seeing its inner workings laid bare. She walked slowly around the perimeter, stopping at various viewpoints. Other visitors moved around her, some listening to audio guides, others taking photos, still others simply standing and staring as she was. The scale of it was difficult to grasp. She tried to imagine it filled with 50,000 people, the noise and energy of the crowds, but it was hard to reconcile that with the quiet ruin before her. A group of schoolchildren passed by, led by a teacher who was explaining something about the velarium, the awning that had once covered the arena. The children listened with varying degrees of attention, some taking notes, others more interested in leaning over the railings. Lyla continued to the second level, where the view was even more expansive. From here she could see the city spreading out beyond the Colosseum, the Forum, Palatine Hill, the green tops of umbrella pines scattered throughout. The air smelled faintly of stone and dust, and somewhere nearby she could hear church bells ringing the hour. She spent perhaps an hour there, moving slowly, sitting occasionally on the stone benches to rest and observe. There was something meditative about it, about being in a place so thoroughly marked by time. She thought about the centuries of life that had passed through here, the countless people who had stood where she was standing now. When she finally left the Colosseum, she made her way to the entrance of the Roman Forum, which was included in her ticket. The path took her past vendors selling bottles of water and postcards, past more tour groups assembling for their guided walks. The Forum stretched out before her, a sprawling field of ruins, columns, arches, foundations of temples and government buildings. She picked up a map at the entrance and began to walk through it, trying to orient herself among the remains. It was quieter here than at the Colosseum, more spread out, and she found herself largely alone as she wandered among the ancient stones. The path was uneven, packed earth and gravel, and she watched her footing as she walked. Wild herbs grew between the ruins, rosemary and fennel, their scents released when she brushed against them. She came upon the Temple of Saturn, its 8 remaining columns, standing in a neat row, and stopped to read the placard explaining its history. It had been one of the oldest temples in Rome, rebuilt multiple times after fires. She tried to imagine it whole, tried to picture the ceremonies that had taken place here, but the gap between then and now felt vast. A cat appeared from behind a pile of stones, orange and sleek, and wound its way between the fallen columns, with the confidence of someone who knew this place intimately. Lyla watched it disappear into the shadows and smiled. She had read that Rome was full of cats, colonies of them living among the ruins, and she was charmed by this evidence of it. She continued through the Forum, stopping at the House of the Vestal Virgins, at the Arch of Titus, at the Basilica of Maxentius with its massive remaining arches. Each site had its own story, its own particular weight of history, and she took her time, not rushing. The path eventually led upward, toward Palatine Hill, and she welcomed the climb. The air was still cool despite the sun, and the exercise felt good after so much standing and slow walking. The hill was green with trees, pine and oak and cypress, and as she climbed higher, the sounds of the city began to fade, replaced by birdsong and the rustle of leaves. At the top, she found the ruins of imperial palaces, their footprints marked out in crumbling walls and mosaic floors. She walked through rooms that had once been grand halls, their ceilings long gone, open now to the sky. In one room, fragments of frescoes still clung to the walls, faded reds and blues, geometric patterns barely visible. From the terrace, she had a sweeping view of the Forum below and the Circus Maximus beyond it, now just a long green field surrounded by ruins. She sat on a stone wall and pulled out the sandwich she had packed that morning, prosciutto and mozzarella on focaccia, and ate it slowly, looking out over the city. A couple sat nearby, speaking quietly in French, consulting a guidebook. An older man was sketching in a notebook, his pencil moving quickly across the page. Lyla finished her sandwich and took a long drink from her water bottle, feeling the pleasant tiredness that came from hours of walking. After resting, she made her way back down the hill and out of the archaeological area, emerging near the Piazza Venezia. The contrast was immediate, from the quiet, timeless atmosphere of the ruins to the noise and traffic of modern Rome. Cars and scooters zipped around the square, horns honking, engines revving. She consulted her map and began walking toward the Pantheon, choosing side streets over main thoroughfares whenever possible. The streets in this part of the city were narrow and shadowed, buildings leaning in close overhead. Laundry hung from some windows, and she caught glimpses of living rooms and kitchens through open shutters. She passed small shops, a butcher, a wine store, a place selling fresh pasta. In one window she saw sheets of lasagna draped over wooden racks, and in another, wheels of cheese stacked from floor to ceiling. The city felt lived in here, not just preserved for tourists but actively inhabited. The Pantheon appeared suddenly, the piazza opening up before her. The building's facade was imposing and perfectly proportioned, the great bronze doors standing open. She joined the queue of people waiting to enter, which moved steadily forward. Inside, the light was different, filtered and soft, falling in a shaft from the oculus at the center of the dome. Lyla tilted her head back to look up at it, at that perfect circle of sky visible through the opening. It was extraordinary, the way the building felt both heavy and light, both enclosed and open to the elements. Rain would fall through that opening, she knew, and snow in winter. There were drains set into the floor to channel the water away. She found this detail moving somehow, this acknowledgement that the building was not sealed off from the world but part of it, subject to weather and seasons like everything else. She walked slowly around the interior, pausing at the various tombs and altars. The space was circular and harmonious, and despite the number of people inside, it felt peaceful. She noticed how the marble floor was worn smooth in places, polished by centuries of footsteps. After spending time in the Pantheon, she emerged back into the afternoon light and made her way to Piazza Navona, just a few minutes' walk away. The square was long and oval, following the outline of the ancient stadium that had once stood here, and it was filled with life. Artists selling paintings, musicians performing, tourists sitting at cafe tables watching the scene. 3 fountains punctuated the piazza, the largest and most elaborate in the center. Lyla approached the Fontana dei Quattro Fiumi, admiring the theatrical sculptures representing 4 great rivers. Water flowed continuously, catching the light, and she stood watching it for several minutes, enjoying the sound and movement. She decided to sit for a while and found a spot on the edge of the fountain where she could rest and people watch. A street artist nearby was drawing caricatures, his subjects sitting patiently while he worked. Children ran through the square, chasing pigeons that took flight in bursts of grey and white. The facades of the buildings surrounding the piazza were painted in warm colors: ochre, burnt sienna, soft pink, and the windows were shuttered against the afternoon sun. She could see flowers on some of the balconies, and laundry still hanging from a few upper windows, despite the public nature of the square. After a while she stood and walked the length of the piazza, past more cafes and restaurants beginning to set up for dinner service. Waiters were folding napkins and polishing glasses, and she caught the scent of something baking, bread perhaps, or pizza. From Piazza Navona she wandered toward Campo dei Fiori, following the tangle of medieval streets. The neighborhood felt more residential here, less polished. She passed a small grocery store where an elderly woman was selecting vegetables, and a bar where a group of men were watching a soccer match on television, their reactions vocal and immediate. Campo dei Fiori opened before her, a large square that she knew hosted a market in the mornings. Now, in the late afternoon, the market stalls were gone, and the square had a different energy. Cafes and wine bars lined the perimeter, their outdoor seating beginning to fill with people settling in for aperitivo. In the center of the square stood a statue of Giordano Bruno, hooded and solemn, marking the spot where he had been executed centuries before. Lyla read the inscription on the base, then sat on a nearby bench, watching the square come to life. She noticed a wine bar that looked inviting, its entrance spilling warm light onto the cobblestones, and decided she would stop there for a glass of wine before continuing to Trastevere. She went inside and found a small table near the window. The bartender brought her a menu, and she ordered a glass of Montepulciano and a small plate of olives and cheese. The wine arrived in a generous pour, deep red and aromatic, and she sipped it slowly, savoring the rich, earthy flavor. The olives were large and meaty, marinated with lemon and herbs, and the cheese was sharp and crumbly. Pecorino, she thought. As she sat there, she watched people passing by outside. A young couple, walking arm in arm, stopping to kiss under a street lamp. A man on a bicycle, weaving skillfully through the pedestrians. A group of friends meeting up, greeting each other with enthusiasm, and kisses on both cheeks. She thought about the layers of history she had walked through today, the way the ancient and the modern existed side by side in this city. It wasn't that they were separate, the old preserved and the new built around it, but rather that they were integrated, the past constantly present, informing and shaping the life of the city. When she finished her wine, she paid and thanked the bartender, then set off toward Trastevere. The walk would take her across the river, and she was looking forward to seeing this neighborhood she had heard described as charming and slightly bohemian. She crossed the Ponte Sisto, a pedestrian bridge that offered views of the Tiber in both directions. The water was greenish-brown, moving slowly, and the banks were lined with plane trees beginning to turn color. A few people were sitting on the steps that led down to the water's edge, and she could hear music coming from somewhere nearby, someone playing guitar and singing. On the other side of the bridge, Trastevere revealed itself in narrow, winding streets and buildings painted in shades of ochre and peach. Ivy climbed the walls and flowers spilled from window boxes. The neighborhood had a village-like feel, despite being in the heart of a major city. Lyla wandered without a particular destination, letting herself get lost in the maze of streets. She passed tiny trattorias with handwritten menus posted outside, their interiors glowing with candlelight. She saw a church with a simple facade and stepped inside briefly. It was quiet and dim, with a few people sitting in the pews, and she stood in the back for a moment, appreciating the stillness. The streets were coming alive as evening approached. Shop owners were standing in their doorways, chatting with neighbors. Cats lounged on doorsteps and windowsills. She heard the clatter of dishes from kitchens, the hiss of espresso machines, the laughter of people gathering for dinner. She came upon the Piazza di Santa Maria, a large square with a beautiful basilica at one end, its facade decorated with mosaics that glowed gold in the setting light. The piazza was busy with people, tourists taking photos, locals catching up, children playing near the fountain in the center. Lyla found a spot on the steps of the fountain and sat down, setting her bag beside her. The fountain featured a shell-shaped basin, with water flowing steadily, and she listened to the sound of it, letting it wash over her. The light was changing now, becoming softer and more golden, and the facades of the buildings seemed to absorb and reflect it, glowing warm. She watched as the mosaics on the basilica caught the last rays of sun, the gold tiles shimmering. A street performer set up nearby, a woman with an accordion, and began to play. The music was melancholy and beautiful, something Eastern European, and several people stopped to listen. Lyla found herself swaying slightly to the rhythm, moved by the unexpected beauty of it. She stayed there as the sky deepened from blue to lavender to a soft, dusky purple. Lights began to come on in the windows around the piazza, and the restaurants started to fill. The smell of cooking drifted across the square, garlic and tomatoes, rosemary and olive oil, the unmistakable scent of Roman cuisine. Lyla realized she was hungry, properly hungry, and decided it was time to find dinner. She walked around the piazza, looking at menus posted outside various trattorias, trying to decide. She chose a small place on a side street, its interior simple and unpretentious, with checkered tablecloths and bottles of wine lining the walls. Inside, she was greeted warmly by a waiter who showed her to a small table near the window. The menu was handwritten and relatively short, which she took as a good sign. She ordered carciofi alla giudea, fried artichokes, crispy and golden to start, and cacio e pepe for her main course. The artichokes arrived first, and they were perfect, crispy on the outside, tender within, seasoned simply with salt and lemon. She ate them slowly, pulling apart the leaves, savoring each bite. The pasta came next, the long strands glossy with butter and cheese, specked with black pepper. It was simple but extraordinary, the kind of food that required no embellishment because the ingredients were so good. She ate in silence, watching the street outside, where people strolled by in the evening warmth. A couple walked past, the woman laughing at something the man had said. A family with 2 young children, the father carrying one child on his shoulders. An elderly couple, moving slowly, arm in arm. For dessert, she ordered panna cotta, which arrived wobbling gently on its plate, topped with a berry compote. It was cool and silky, a perfect ending to the meal. She finished with an espresso, strong and dark, served in a tiny cup. When she paid the bill and stepped back outside, the night had fully settled in. The streets of Trastevere were still lively, but had taken on a different quality, more intimate, more relaxed. People lingered over wine at outdoor tables, and she could hear singing coming from a bar somewhere nearby. She walked slowly through the neighborhood, letting herself wander without direction. The streets curved and branched in unexpected ways, and she didn't try to track where she was going, content to simply move through this place that felt so removed from the grand monuments she had seen earlier. She passed a small bookshop that was still open, its window display featuring Italian classics and travel guides. Through the doorway, she could see shelves packed tightly with books, and a woman sitting behind the counter reading. Lyla paused, tempted to go in, but decided to keep walking instead, carrying the image with her. The neighborhood felt lived in and real in a way that made her feel somehow less like a visitor. People nodded to her as they passed, and she nodded back. A group of teenagers sat on a doorstep, talking and laughing, and they barely glanced at her as she walked by. It was this, she thought, that made a place feel welcoming. Not grand gestures but small acknowledgments. The simple fact of being allowed to exist in a space without fanfare. She found herself on a quieter street now, away from the main piazza. The buildings here were simpler, their facades unadorned, and she could hear the sound of a television through an open window, and somewhere nearby, someone practicing piano, scales moving up and down, patient and repetitive. A small park appeared on her left, just a pocket of green with a few benches, and she decided to sit for a while. The bench was cool beneath her, and she set her bag down beside her. Above, the sky had deepened to a rich dark blue, and she could see a few stars despite the city lights. She thought about the day, about all the walking she had done, all the layers of history she had moved through. The ancient stones of the Colosseum and Forum, the perfect geometry of the Pantheon, the Baroque exuberance of the fountains in Piazza Navona. And now this, the quiet present moment in a residential neighborhood, just as much a part of Rome as all the rest. A cat emerged from beneath a hedge and regarded her calmly before continuing on its way, disappearing into the shadows. She heard footsteps approaching and saw an elderly man walking a small dog, the two of them moving at a leisurely pace. He wished her good evening as he passed, and she returned the greeting, charmed by the formality of it. It occurred to her that she could stay here for a while, that there was no hurry to go anywhere. Her hotel was across the river, but it wasn't far, and the night was still young enough. She settled more comfortably on the bench, letting her shoulders relax, feeling the pleasant tiredness in her legs and feet. The sounds of the neighborhood continued around her, distant conversations, music from a bar a few streets away, the occasional scooter passing by. But here in this small park, she felt held in a pocket of quiet, a small pause in the rhythm of the evening. She watched the windows of the buildings across the street. In one, she could see someone moving around a kitchen, and in another, a family gathered around a dinner table. These glimpses of ordinary life felt precious somehow, reminders that Rome was not just a museum but a living city, full of people going about their daily routines. After a while, she stood and continued walking, following a street that seemed to lead slightly uphill. The neighborhood changed subtly, the buildings a bit more worn, the streets even narrower. She passed a corner shrine, a small niche in a wall containing a painted image of the Madonna, fresh flowers placed in a jar below it. She came upon another small piazza, this one circular and intimate, with a single street lamp casting a pool of warm light in its center. A few people sat on the rim of a small fountain, talking quietly, and a couple stood nearby, embracing. Lyla walked around the perimeter, noting the way the buildings curved to follow the shape of the square, creating a sense of enclosure that felt protective rather than confining. It was getting later now, and she could feel the day settling into her body, a gentle weight that spoke of rest. But she wasn't quite ready to leave Trastevere, not yet. There was something about this neighborhood that invited lingering, that made her want to absorb just a bit more of its particular atmosphere. She found a small wine bar on a side street, its entrance marked only by a wooden sign and a soft glow from within. She went inside and found it nearly empty, just a few people sitting at the bar and one couple at a corner table. The bartender looked up and smiled, gesturing toward the bar stools, and she took a seat. The space was tiny and cozy, with brick walls and wooden shelves lined with bottles. She ordered a glass of white wine, something local, and the bartender poured it with care, setting it before her, along with a small dish of roasted almonds. The wine was crisp and mineral, with a hint of citrus, and she sipped it slowly, savoring the cool, bright flavor. The almonds were warm and salty, a perfect complement. She sat quietly, listening to the low murmur of conversation around her, the clink of glasses, the occasional laugh. The bartender was polishing wine glasses, holding each one up to the light to check for spots. He worked with the ease of long practice, and she found something soothing in watching the repetitive motion. No one seemed in a hurry here. The couple in the corner was sharing a bottle of red wine, and they sat close together, speaking in low voices, occasionally touching hands across the table. Lyla finished her wine and paid, thanking the bartender. He wished her a pleasant evening, and she stepped back out into the street, which had grown quieter still. Many of the shops had closed now, their shutters drawn, and the restaurants were beginning to empty as diners finished their meals and headed home. She walked back toward the piazza with the basilica and the fountain. It was less crowded now, though a few people still lingered. The accordion player was gone, but the fountain continued its steady flow, and the mosaics on the church facade still held a faint glow from the street lamps. Lyla sat on the steps of the fountain once more, in almost the same spot she had chosen earlier. The stone was cool now, having released the day's warmth, and she felt the chill of it through her jeans. She didn't mind. It felt grounding, connecting her to this particular place, this particular moment. She thought about how the day had unfolded, each part flowing naturally into the next. The arrival by train, the long walk to the Colosseum, the hours spent among ruins, the transition to the busier streets around the Pantheon and Piazza Navona, and finally this, the gentle evening in Trastevere. It had been a full day, rich with experience, but she didn't feel overwhelmed by it. Instead, she felt satisfied, as if she had moved through Rome at exactly the right pace, giving each place its due attention without rushing or lingering too long. The piazza was quiet now, most of the tourists gone, and it felt more like it might at any time of year, on any ordinary evening. A man was walking his dog, letting it sniff at the base of the fountain. Two women sat on the church steps, talking with animation, their hands moving expressively. The waiters at the nearby restaurants were clearing tables, stacking chairs, preparing to close. Lyla sat and simply breathed, taking in the cool night air, the scent of the fountain's water, the faint smell of coffee and wine still hanging in the air. She felt her body settling, the accumulated miles of walking expressing themselves as a pleasant heaviness in her limbs. She knew she would leave soon, but for now she was content to sit here a little longer, to let the day complete itself naturally, without force or hurry. This was what she had come for, these moments of quiet presence in a beautiful place, the chance to simply be somewhere different, to let that difference work its gentle magic on her perspective. Above, the stars were clearer now, as some of the lights in the surrounding buildings went dark. She could make out a few constellations, though the city's glow obscured the fainter stars. It didn't matter. What she could see was enough. The church, the fountain, the warm glow of the remaining lights, the shapes of people moving slowly through the square. She stood finally, stretching slightly, feeling her body protest gently and then release. She picked up her bag and took one more look around the piazza, committing it to memory, the way the light fell, the sound of the water, the feel of the air. Then she began to walk, slowly, feeling the simple pleasure of moving through this place she had grown fond of over the course of the evening. The neighborhood embraced her with its quiet streets and softly lit windows, and she let herself be held by it, carried gently through the last moments of this long, full day in Rome.